Sarah Martinez wiped her hands on her scrubs as she hurried through the hospital parking lot, her 12-hour shift finally over. At 32, she had learned to carry exhaustion like a familiar weight, but the thought of Tommy waiting at home always gave her that final burst of energy she needed. 2 years had passed since David's death, and she had built their new normal one careful day at a time, working extra shifts at the hospital, making sure Tommy's homework was done, reading bedtime stories, even when her voice was hoarse from talking to patients all day. Their small apartment wasn't much, but it was theirs. Tommy's drawings covered the refrigerator, his soccer trophies lined the windowsill, and every evening they shared dinner at their little table while he told her about his day. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a good life. A life filled with love, laughter, and the kind of quiet contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you need to be. That contentment shattered the moment she opened her front door and found the court papers taped to the frame. "Emergency petition for custody," the bold letters proclaimed. Sarah's hands trembled as she read her mother-in-law's name at the top of the legal document. Margaret Wellington, David's mother, the woman who had barely spoken to Sarah since the funeral, was seeking immediate custody of Tommy. The accusations hit like physical blows. Unfit mother, child neglect, mental instability following spouse's death. Sarah sank onto her couch, still in her scrubs, reading words that painted her as a dangerous stranger rather than the mother who had kissed Tommy's scraped knees and sung him to sleep every night for 8 years. Margaret's legal team had been thorough. Photographs showed Sarah's apartment in disarray, dishes in the sink, laundry on the couch, Tommy's toys scattered across the floor. But these weren't candid shots of their real life. They were staged, manipulated images that made their cozy home look like a disaster zone. A neighbor Sarah had never met swore in an affidavit that she had seen Tommy wandering the apartment complex alone at night, hungry and crying. Most damaging of all were her medical records, somehow obtained and twisted to suggest that her grief counseling and brief prescription for antidepressants after David's death proved she was mentally unfit to care for her son. The phone call came at dawn. Margaret's voice was cold, clinical. "The court has granted temporary custody," she said without preamble. "Tommy will be staying with me until the hearing. It's what's best for him, Sarah. You must see that." "You can't do this," Sarah whispered, her world tilting on its axis. "He's my son. He's David's son too. And David would want him to be safe." The social worker arrived an hour later with kind eyes and apologetic words. Tommy clung to Sarah, confused and frightened as she packed his clothes into a small suitcase. "Mommy, what's happening? Why can't I stay home?" Sarah knelt down to his level, her heart breaking as she struggled to find words. "You're going to stay with Grandma Margaret for a few days, sweetheart, just until we can figure some things out." "But I don't want to go, I want to stay with you." "I know, baby. I know." She held him tight, memorizing the feeling of his small arms around her neck. "But sometimes grown-ups have to make decisions that don't make sense to kids. I promise I'm going to fix this, okay? I promise." As the social worker's car pulled away with Tommy's tear-stained face pressed against the rear window, Sarah collapsed on her front steps. 2 years of careful rebuilding, of proving to herself and the world that she could be enough for her son, had crumbled in a single morning. Margaret Wellington, with her mansion and her money and her connections, had taken the one thing that mattered most. But as Sarah sat there in her nurse's scrubs, still smelling of hospital disinfectant, something began to burn in her chest. It wasn't just grief or fear, it was rage. Pure, clarifying rage at the injustice of it all. Margaret might have won the first battle, but Sarah Martinez wasn't going down without a fight. Tommy needed her, and she would move heaven and earth to bring him home. The first 3 days without Tommy passed in a blur of frantic phone calls and legal consultations. Sarah had emptied her savings account to hire Jennifer Rebbees, a family attorney with kind eyes and a reputation for fighting hard for her clients. It was during their second meeting that the pieces began falling into place. "Something doesn't add up," Jennifer said, spreading Margaret's petition across her desk. "Emergency custody is reserved for cases of immediate danger, abuse, neglect, abandonment. But the evidence here," she tapped the fabricated photos with her pen. "It's elaborate, too elaborate. This took time to orchestrate." Sarah stared at the doctored images of her home. "She's been planning this, for months, I'd say. The question is why now? What changed?" The answer came to Sarah like a punch to the gut. "Tommy's birthday is next month. He'll be 9. Her voice cracked. David and I always talked about taking him to Disneyland for his 9th birthday. It was going to be this big celebration." Jennifer's expression softened. "The anniversary of your husband's death was 6 months ago, wasn't it?" March 15th. Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. "She blamed me, you know. At the funeral she said if I hadn't called David about Tommy's science project, he wouldn't have been rushing home. He wouldn't have been on that road in the rain." The memory hit Sarah with fresh force. David had been working late, and Tommy was in tears because he'd forgotten to mention his volcano project was due the next day. Sarah had called her husband, apologetic and embarrassed, and David had laughed it off. "No worries, babe. I'll pick up supplies on my way home. We'll build the best volcano Mrs. Peterson has ever seen." He never made it to the store. "Margaret wants him because he's all that's left of David," Sarah whispered, "and she wants to punish me for what she thinks I did." Over the next few days, Sarah's investigation revealed the depth of Margaret's manipulation. Her neighbor Mrs. Chen mentioned seeing that fancy woman asking questions about Sarah months ago. Tommy's teacher, Miss Rodriguez, admitted that Margaret had visited the school, expressing concerns about Tommy's emotional state and asking detailed questions about Sarah's involvement in his education. Most damaging was what Sarah discovered about Tommy himself. When she was finally granted a supervised visit, she noticed changes in her son that chilled her to the bone. He was quieter, more withdrawn. When she hugged him, he seemed to pull back slightly, as if unsure. "Grandma Margaret says you're sick," Tommy said quietly as they sat in the sterile family services office, a social worker watching from the corner. "She says that's why you cry sometimes. She says crying moms can't take good care of their kids." Sarah's heart clenched. "Tommy, sweetheart, everyone cries sometimes. Even moms. It doesn't mean we're sick or that we can't love you. But she says you have to work all the time because you don't know how to manage money like Daddy did. She says if I lived with her, I wouldn't have to worry about you being sad or tired." The manipulation was insidious, designed to make Tommy question his mother's love while positioning Margaret as his savior. Sarah realized that Margaret hadn't just fabricated evidence, she had been systematically poisoning her grandson's mind, planting seeds of doubt about the woman who had raised him with unwavering devotion. "She bought me a new iPad," Tommy continued, not meeting his mother's eyes. "And she says if I stay with her, I can have my own room with a big TV and all the toys I want. She says you can visit sometimes." Sarah felt sick. Margaret was bribing her son while simultaneously undermining their relationship. She was using her wealth as a weapon, making Tommy feel guilty for the modest life Sarah could provide. As the supervised visit ended, and Sarah watched Tommy leave with the social worker, she understood the full scope of what she was facing. This wasn't just about custody, it was about Margaret systematically erasing Sarah from her son's life while rewriting history to make herself the hero. Margaret Wellington had declared war on Sarah's family, using Tommy as both weapon and prize. But Margaret had made one crucial mistake: she had underestimated a mother's love and the lengths to which Sarah would go to protect her child. Sarah walked out of that building with a new understanding. She wasn't just fighting for custody, she was fighting for Tommy's soul, for his ability to trust and love without manipulation. Margaret might have money and connections, but Sarah had something more powerful: the truth and 8 years of genuine love that no amount of money could counterfeit. The real battle was just beginning. Sarah's transformation began the morning after her supervised visit with Tommy. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold, surrounded by legal documents and a notebook filled with her own observations. If Margaret wanted to play dirty, Sarah would have to be smarter, not just stronger. Her first call was to Jennifer Reyes. "I need to know everything about Margaret Wellington. Her finances, her history, her connections, everything." "Sarah, that kind of investigation costs money. Then I'll work double shifts. I'll sell my car if I have to." Sarah's voice was steel. "She's been planning this for months. I need to know what I'm really up against." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "I might know someone who could help, pro bono." That's how Sarah met Carlos Mendoza, a private investigator who specialized in family court cases. A former social worker himself, Carlos had seen too many good parents lose their children to manipulation and wealth. Something about Sarah's case had touched him. "Margaret Wellington," he said, reviewing the custody petition. "I know that name. She's got her fingers in half the charity boards in this city. Real estate money, old family connections." He looked up at Sarah. But money doesn't make someone a good guardian. Let's see what we can find. While Carlos began his investigation, Sarah started building her own defense. She documented everything, every phone call with Tommy, every interaction with social services, every piece of evidence that could prove her fitness as a mother. She reached out to Tommy's teacher, Miss Rodriguez, who immediately agreed to testify. "That boy adores you," Miss Rodriguez said during their meeting. "In all my years of teaching, I've never seen a child light up the way Tommy does when he talks about his mom. He used to bring me drawings of you in your nurse uniform, calling you his hero." Dr. Patricia Vance, Tommy's pediatrician, was equally supportive. "Tommy has never missed a checkup, never shown signs of neglect or abuse. Sarah is one of the most attentive mothers I work with. This custody petition is completely unfounded." Sarah's supervisor at the hospital, Linda Chang, not only agreed to testify but offered to adjust Sarah's schedule to accommodate court proceedings. "You're one of our best nurses," Linda said firmly. "Patient advocacy, compassion, attention to detail, everything that makes you excellent at your job makes you an excellent mother." But Sarah knew defense wouldn't be enough. She needed to expose Margaret's true nature, and that meant digging into the past. The breakthrough came when Carlos discovered David's old belongings in storage, boxes Margaret had insisted on keeping after the funeral. Hidden among David's college textbooks was a journal he'd kept during his final year of law school. "Mom called again today, asking about my grades, my professors, my study schedule. She wants to know every detail of my life, as if I'm still 12 years old. Sarah keeps saying I should set boundaries, but Mom makes it so difficult. She has this way of making you feel guilty for wanting independence. Sometimes I feel like I can't breathe around her. Told Mom about the engagement today. She didn't congratulate us. Instead, she spent an hour explaining why Sarah isn't right for our family. She thinks Sarah is too common, that she'll hold me back. I love Mom, but I'm starting to see what Sarah means about her need to control everything. The wedding planning is a nightmare. Mom has opinions about everything, the venue, the flowers, the guest list. She actually told Sarah that her family doesn't understand our traditions. I had to leave the room before I said something I'd regret. Sarah is handling it with more grace than Mom deserves." Each entry painted a picture of Margaret's controlling nature, her need to dominate her son's life, and her resentment toward Sarah from the very beginning. But the most damaging entry came from just months before David's death. "Had dinner with Mom tonight. She kept talking about how Sarah monopolizes my time, how I never visit her anymore. She actually suggested that Tommy would be better off spending more time with her. That Sarah's work schedule isn't healthy for a child. I told her to back off, but she got that look in her eyes, the same one she had when I chose to go to law school instead of business school. She doesn't forgive, and she doesn't forget." Sarah's hands shook as she read her late husband's words. Margaret's behavior wasn't grief-driven, it was the culmination of years of resentment and control. Carlos's investigation revealed more disturbing patterns. Margaret had a history of involving herself in her neighbors' family disputes, always positioning herself as the voice of reason while subtly undermining relationships. She had served on the board of a children's charity until other board members quietly requested her resignation after complaints about her aggressive advocacy methods. Most importantly, Carlos discovered the truth about Margaret's evidence. The neighbor who had provided the false testimony had recently received a substantial donation to her daughter's private school tuition fund, a donation that came from one of Margaret's shell companies. The photographer who had taken the staged pictures of Sarah's apartment had been hired through an intermediary, but bank records showed the payment originated from Margaret's personal account. "She's not just rich," Carlos explained to Sarah. "She's smart and connected. But she's also arrogant. She left a paper trail because she never expected anyone to look this deep." As the custody hearing approached, Sarah felt a shift in herself. She was no longer the devastated mother who had collapsed on her front steps. She had become a strategist, a fighter, someone who understood that sometimes love meant going to war. Her final preparation was the hardest. She had to trust that Tommy, despite Margaret's manipulation, would recognize the truth when it mattered most. During their last supervised visit before the hearing, Sarah looked into her son's eyes and saw the boy she had raised, confused and hurting, but still hers. "Tommy," she said quietly, taking his small hands in hers. Whatever happens in court, I want you to remember something. I love you more than anything in this world. That will never change, no matter what anyone tells you. And if anyone asks you questions, just tell the truth about how you feel. That's all you ever have to do, tell the truth." Tommy nodded, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah saw a flicker of her old son in his eyes. Margaret Wellington had spent months building her case on lies and manipulation, but Sarah had something more powerful: the truth, and a mother's unwavering love. The real battle would be fought in that courtroom, but Sarah was ready. She had learned to fight on Margaret's level, with strategy, evidence, and determination. But she would win on her own terms, with honesty and the kind of love that couldn't be bought or fabricated. The hearing was 2 days away, and Sarah Martinez was ready for war. Margaret Wellington didn't become one of the city's most influential women by backing down from a fight. When her private investigator informed her that Sarah was building a strong defense, Margaret's response was swift and ruthless. The first blow came at Sarah's workplace. Dr. Harrison, the hospital's chief administrator, called Sarah into his office with a grave expression. "I've received some concerning complaints about your performance," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. Sarah's heart sank as she read the anonymous reports. A patient claimed she had been distracted and unprofessional. Another alleged she had made medication errors. A third suggested she had been emotionally unstable during her shifts. "These are all lies," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "You know my record. You know the kind of nurse I am." Dr. Harrison's expression was pained. "Sarah, I've worked with you for 5 years. I know your character, but I have to follow protocol. You're being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation." Sarah walked out of the hospital in a daze. Without her job, she had no income, no way to pay for her legal defense. Margaret was systematically destroying every pillar of Sarah's life. The attacks continued throughout the week. Sarah's landlord received an anonymous complaint about noise disturbances and suspicious activity in her apartment. Her car was vandalized twice in 3 days. Most painfully, several of Tommy's friends' parents suddenly became unavailable when Sarah tried to gather testimonials about her parenting. "She scared them," Jennifer explained during an emergency meeting. "Margaret has connections throughout this community. People are afraid to cross her." But Margaret's most devastating attack was yet to come. During Sarah's next supervised visit with Tommy, she immediately noticed a change in her son. He was more withdrawn than ever, barely making eye contact. "Tommy, sweetheart, what's wrong?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside his chair. "Grandma Margaret showed me pictures," he said quietly, not looking up from the toy he was fidgeting with. "What kind of pictures?" "Pictures of Daddy when he was little." She said, "You never knew Daddy when he was happy." She said Daddy was different before he met you, that he used to smile more. Tommy's voice broke. She said, "Maybe Daddy would still be alive if he hadn't been rushing home to help us." Sarah felt the room spin around her. Margaret had weaponized Tommy's grief, turning her son's love for his father into a source of guilt about their relationship. It was psychological warfare of the cruelest kind. "Tommy, look at me," Sarah said gently, lifting his chin. "Your daddy loved us both. He was happy with us. He would never want you to feel guilty about what happened to him." But she could see the confusion in her son's eyes. The poison Margaret had dripped into his young mind. Tommy was 8 years old, trying to process grief, loyalty, and manipulation all at once. The social worker intervened, noting Tommy's distress, and the visit was cut short. As Sarah watched her son leave, she realized Margaret had found her most effective weapon, turning Tommy's love for his father against his love for his mother. Margaret's final escalation came the night before the custody hearing. Sarah received a call from an unknown number. "Miss Martinez, this is Detective Williams with the city police. We've received a report of child endangerment. We need to speak with you." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What kind of report?" "An anonymous tip claiming you've been making threats against the child's current guardian. We need you to come to the station for questioning." Sarah spent 3 hours at the police station, answering questions about threats she had never made, providing alibis for times she was supposedly harassing Margaret. The detective was professional but thorough, clearly following up on what he believed was a credible complaint. "Miss Martinez, I'm not going to arrest you tonight," Detective Williams finally said. But I have to advise you that making threats against individuals involved in custody proceedings is a serious matter. It could impact your case. Sarah drove home in a fog of exhaustion and despair. Margaret had timed this perfectly, ensuring Sarah would be rattled and sleep-deprived for the most important day of her life. But as she sat in her empty apartment, surrounded by Tommy's toys and drawings, Sarah felt something unexpected. A cold, clear fury. Margaret had overplayed her hand. In her desperation to destroy Sarah, she had revealed the true depths of her manipulation and cruelty. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Jennifer. "She's gone too far," Sarah said. "The police questioning, the job sabotage. What she's doing to Tommy's mind. She's showing the court exactly who she really is." "What do you mean?" Jennifer asked. "Margaret thinks she's chess grandmaster, but she's actually just a bully. And bullies make mistakes when they get desperate." Sarah looked at the custody papers on her coffee table. "Document everything that happened tonight. Every lie she's told, every manipulation she's used. She's not just unfit to have custody, she's dangerous to Tommy's emotional well-being." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, are you sure you're ready for tomorrow? This has been a lot." "I'm ready," Sarah interrupted. "Margaret has spent months trying to break me down, but she's forgotten something important. She's hurt my son Jennifer. She's confused him, manipulated him, used his grief as a weapon. I'm not just fighting for custody anymore. I'm fighting to protect Tommy from her." As Sarah finally fell asleep in the early hours of the morning, she held on to one thought. Margaret had revealed her true nature through her escalating attacks. Tomorrow, in front of a judge, Sarah would make sure everyone saw Margaret Wellington for exactly what she was. Not a concerned grandmother, but a dangerous manipulator who would sacrifice a child's well-being for her own twisted sense of justice. The battle had pushed both women to their limits. But Sarah had something Margaret could never understand. A mother's love doesn't break under pressure. It becomes stronger, more focused, more determined. Tomorrow that love would finally have its day in court. Judge Patricia Morrison had presided over family court for 15 years, and she prided herself on seeing through manipulation and getting to the truth. As she reviewed the Wellington v. Martinez custody file that morning, she noted the unusual circumstances: emergency custody granted based on serious allegations, followed by extensive counterfilings that painted a very different picture. The courtroom was smaller than Sarah had expected, but it felt enormous as she took her seat beside Jennifer. Across the aisle, Margaret sat with her team of 3 attorneys, her silver hair perfectly styled, her navy suit impeccable. She looked every inch the respectable grandmother, the picture of stability and resources. Margaret's lead attorney, Harrison Blackwood, presented their case with polished confidence. "Your Honor, Mrs. Wellington seeks custody of her grandson not out of malice, but out of genuine concern for the child's welfare. The evidence clearly shows that Miss Martinez, while perhaps well-intentioned, is simply unable to provide the stable, nurturing environment this child needs." Blackwood methodically presented the fabricated evidence, the staged photographs of Sarah's apartment, the false neighbor testimony, the doctored medical records. He painted Sarah as a woman overwhelmed by grief, struggling financially, unable to properly care for her son. "Tommy Wellington Martinez deserves better than this uncertainty," Blackwood concluded. "He deserves the security, stability, and resources that Mrs. Wellington can provide. A child should not have to worry about whether the electricity will be paid or whether his mother will come home from work too exhausted to help with homework." Sarah watched the judge's face carefully, looking for any sign of how the arguments were being received. Judge Morrison was taking notes, her expression neutral but attentive. When Jennifer rose to present Sarah's defense, the atmosphere in the room shifted. "Your Honor, this case isn't about providing better opportunities for a child. It's about a woman who has systematically manipulated evidence, bribed witnesses, and psychologically abused her own grandson in order to satisfy her own need for control and revenge." Jennifer's presentation was devastating. She exposed the bribed neighbor, revealing bank records that showed Margaret's shell company had paid the woman's daughter's school tuition. She presented the real photographs of Sarah's apartment, lived in but clean, filled with Tommy's artwork and evidence of a loving home. She called Dr. Vance, who testified about Tommy's excellent health and Sarah's attentive care. Miss Rodriguez spoke about Tommy's academic performance and his obvious love for his mother. But the most powerful evidence was David's journal. Jennifer read selected entries aloud, showing Margaret's pattern of control and manipulation that dated back years before David's death. "This isn't grief, Your Honor," Jennifer said, holding up the journal. "This is the continuation of a pattern of controlling behavior that Mrs. Wellington's own son documented extensively. She resented Miss Martinez from the beginning, and she is using this child as a weapon in her personal vendetta." Margaret's attorneys objected repeatedly, but the damage was clear. The judge's expression had hardened as she listened to David's words describing his mother's manipulation. Blackwood's rebuttal was weaker, focusing on Margaret's financial stability and community standing. But when he suggested that Sarah's grief counseling proved she was mentally unstable, Judge Morrison interrupted. "Counsel, are you suggesting that seeking help for grief after losing a spouse indicates unfitness as a parent?" "No, Your Honor, but because I would find that a responsible parent would seek appropriate support during a difficult time, not ignore their emotional needs." The first day of hearings concluded with both sides presenting their cases. That evening, Sarah barely slept, knowing that tomorrow would bring the most critical moment: Tommy's interview with the judge. The second day began with Judge Morrison calling Tommy into her chambers. Court protocol required that the 8-year-old speak with the judge privately, away from the pressure and presence of both parties. Sarah's heart pounded as she waited in the hallway outside the judge's chambers. Through the closed door she could hear the murmur of conversation but couldn't make out words. Jennifer sat beside her, occasionally squeezing her hand in support. After 45 minutes that felt like hours, the judge's clerk emerged. "The court will reconvene in 10 minutes. Back in the courtroom, Judge Morrison's expression was unreadable as she took her seat. Margaret looked confident, clearly believing that her months of manipulation had succeeded in turning Tommy against his mother. "This court has had the opportunity to speak extensively with Tommy Wellington Martinez," Judge Morrison began. "I want to share with you what this young man told me, because his words have been illuminating." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. "When I asked Tommy about his living situation, he told me about the gifts his grandmother had given him, the iPad, the promises of a big room, all the toys he could want. He also told me about the conversations they had about his mother." Margaret's attorney shifted uncomfortably. "Tommy told me that his grandmother explained to him that his mother was too sad to take care of him properly, that she worked too much because she didn't know how to manage money like his father did, that maybe his father would still be alive if he hadn't been rushing home to help them." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she realized how much poison Margaret had dripped into her son's mind. But then Judge Morrison continued, "I asked Tommy a simple question. I asked him what he missed most when he thought about home." The courtroom was completely silent. Tommy didn't talk about toys or big rooms or iPads. He talked about Saturday morning pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. He talked about how his mother sings to him when he has nightmares about his father. He talked about reading books together on the couch and how his mother always knows exactly what to say when he's scared or sad. Margaret's face was becoming pale, and then Tommy said something that stopped me in my tracks. He said, "Judge Morrison, Grandma Margaret has a big house and lots of money, but my mom has a big heart. She cries sometimes because she misses Daddy, but she still reads to me every night and makes my favorite pancakes. Grandma Margaret never asked what my favorite pancakes are. She just tells me what I should want." Sarah's tears fell freely now, pride and relief flooding through her. "But what truly concerned me," Judge Morrison continued, her voice growing stern, "was when Tommy asked me if he was a bad boy for missing his mother. An 8-year-old child should never be made to feel guilty for loving his parent. Yet Mrs. Wellington's approach has created exactly that kind of emotional confusion and guilt in this child." Margaret's attorney stood. "Your Honor, Mrs. Wellington was simply trying to—" "Sit down, counsel." Judge Morrison's voice was sharp. "I'm not finished." The judge turned her attention directly to Margaret. "Mrs. Wellington, in my 15 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a calculated campaign to manipulate not just the court system but a grieving child's emotions. You have used your grandson's love for his deceased father as a weapon against his mother. You have bribed witnesses, fabricated evidence, and attempted to systematically destroy Miss Martinez's reputation and livelihood." Margaret's composure finally cracked, her face flushing with anger and humiliation. This court finds that Tommy Wellington Martinez belongs with his mother, Sarah Martinez, who has demonstrated nothing but love, dedication, and appropriate care for her son. Custody is hereby returned to Miss Martinez immediately. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, Mrs. Wellington, your visitation rights will be restricted to supervised visits twice per month, contingent upon your participation in family counseling. Your behavior has been manipulative and harmful to this child's emotional well-being. As the gavel came down, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Across the aisle, Margaret sat in stunned silence, her carefully constructed case crumbling around her. Tommy was brought into the courtroom, and when he saw his mother, he ran straight into her arms. "Mommy, I want to go home," he whispered against her neck. "We're going home, baby," Sarah whispered back, holding him tight. "We're going home right now." In that moment, surrounded by the chaos of a courtroom victory, Sarah understood that they had won something far more important than a custody case. They had won the right to heal together, to rebuild their trust, and to move forward without the shadow of Margaret's manipulation. The truth had finally been heard, and Tommy's own words, innocent, honest, and filled with love, had been the key that unlocked their freedom. The consequences of Judge Morrison's decision rippled through the community like stones dropped in still water. Within days of the hearing, Margaret Wellington discovered that her carefully constructed reputation was crumbling as quickly as her custody case had collapsed. The court's official findings were damning. Judge Morrison didn't merely award custody back to Sarah, she issued a formal censure against Margaret for willful deception, witness tampering, and emotional manipulation of a minor child. The judge's written opinion, which became part of public record, detailed every fabricated piece of evidence and concluded with a rare judicial condemnation. This court finds that Mrs. Wellington's actions represent a profound abuse of the legal system and a callous disregard for the emotional welfare of the child she claimed to want to protect. The legal consequences followed swiftly. The district attorney's office, prompted by the judge's findings, launched an investigation into Margaret's perjury and evidence tampering. While criminal charges were ultimately not filed due to the complexities of family court proceedings, the investigation itself became public knowledge. Margaret's shell company transactions, the bribed witnesses, and her systematic campaign against Sarah were all documented in official reports. Her social standing, which had taken decades to build, collapsed almost overnight. Board positions at prestigious charities were quietly rescinded. The country club where she had held court for years suddenly found her membership under review. Former friends crossed the street to avoid uncomfortable conversations. The community that had once revered Margaret Wellington now whispered about her manipulation and lies. For Sarah, the victory was about far more than legal vindication. Standing in their small apartment the evening after the hearing, watching Tommy play with his toys on the living room floor, she felt a profound shift in her understanding of herself. She had always defined herself in relation to others, as David's wife, as Tommy's mother, as a nurse helping patients. But in fighting for her son, she had discovered an inner strength she never knew existed. "I'm proud of you, Mommy," Tommy said that first night back home, as Sarah tucked him into his own bed for the first time in weeks. "You fought for us like a superhero." Sarah smiled, smoothing his hair. "Sometimes being a superhero just means not giving up on the people you love." The healing process wasn't immediate or simple. Tommy needed time to process the confusion Margaret had sown in his young mind. Sarah arranged for family counseling, where they worked through his conflicted feelings about his grandmother and his guilt over the things he had said and felt during those difficult weeks. "I was mad at you sometimes," Tommy admitted during one session. "When Grandma Margaret said you were too sad to take care of me, I believed her. I felt bad for believing her, but I did." "It's okay to have believed her," Sarah replied gently. "She's a grown-up, and she told you things that sounded like they might be true. But now you know the difference between someone who loves you and someone who tries to use you." Gradually they established a new normal. Sarah returned to work at the hospital, where her colleagues welcomed her back with a mixture of relief and outrage over what she had endured. Dr. Harrison personally apologized for the administrative leave, explaining that the hospital had since implemented new protocols to prevent false complaints from being used as weapons in personal disputes. The question of Margaret's role in their lives required careful consideration. Despite everything that had happened, Sarah recognized that Tommy needed to understand his family history and maintain some connection to his father's side of the family. However, this would only happen on their terms, with clear boundaries and supervision. The supervised visits were awkward at first. Margaret, stripped of her power and influence, seemed smaller somehow. She made tentative attempts at apology, though Sarah remained skeptical of her sincerity. More importantly, Tommy began to see his grandmother differently, not as the powerful figure who could give him everything he wanted, but as a flawed person who had made serious mistakes. "She's still family," Sarah explained to Tommy after one particularly difficult visit. "But being family doesn't mean we have to accept being treated badly. We can love people and still protect ourselves from them." 6 months after the custody battle ended, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Margaret stood at her door, without lawyers or pretense, looking older and more fragile than Sarah had ever seen her. "I wanted to apologize," Margaret said quietly. "Not for the lawyers or the court, for what I did to Tommy, for what I did to you." Sarah studied her former adversary carefully. "Do you understand what you did to him? How you confused him and used his love for his father against him?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I was so angry, I blamed you for David's death, and I couldn't see past that anger. I convinced myself I was protecting Tommy, but I was really just trying to hurt you, and I hurt him instead." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, and maybe not ever, but it was acknowledgement, and it was a start. As the 1-year anniversary of the custody battle approached, Sarah reflected on how profoundly their lives had changed. Tommy was thriving in school, his confidence restored, his relationship with his mother stronger than ever. Sarah had been promoted to charge nurse, her reputation enhanced rather than damaged by her willingness to fight for what was right. Most importantly, they had learned that love doesn't make you weak, it makes you fierce. That truth is more powerful than money or influence. And that sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy, but protecting what matters most, no matter the cost. Standing in their small kitchen one Saturday morning, making dinosaur-shaped pancakes, while Tommy told her about his dreams from the night before that, Sarah realized that they had won something more valuable than any custody case. They had won their freedom to love each other without fear, to build their future on their own terms, and to face whatever challenges came next, with the unshakable knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged, together at home, surrounded by the kind of love that no amount of money could buy, and no manipulation could destroy.